Hello everyone, my name is Peter. I hope you're all keeping well. I feel like it's been a long time since I said that at the start of one of my videos, so I hope you're all doing well. How are you doing? Are you doing okay? I'm going to assume you said yes, so good. In today's video we're going to rank the studio albums of one of my favourite active musicians. He's one of the most creative and forward-thinking minds in the worlds of hip-hop, jazz and electronic music. And that is, of course, Flying Lotus. Flying Lotus is the stage name of Steven Ellison, a California DJ, producer, rapper, even filmmaker. He's the founder of the Brainfeeder record label, and he has signed a plethora of artists who make similar quality and similar style music to what he does. The man has built quite a name for himself since really entering into the music scene in 2006, working with artists amongst the broader jazz field like Herbie Hancock, Thundercat, Kamasi Washington, as well as a load of other artists outside of jazz like Tom York, Solange Knowles, Kendrick Lamar, Danny Brown, Anderson .Paak, the list goes on. Flying Lotus's style is one that has undergone a gradual evolution from a blend of hip-hop with electronic music and IDM to one that more encompasses jazz, hip-hop and electronic music and oftentimes blurs the lines between all three. Before we start, I want to make it known that I'm only going to be talking about Flylo's core studio albums, so you're not going to find any EPs on here, you're not going to find the Duality mixtape he dropped under his rapper alter ego Captain Murphy. We're just going to be working with the 6 core Flying Lotus studio albums, so of course, let's begin with number 6. Much like my Kanye West Worst to Best Albums video, I'm going to start with the artist's latest album. In this case, it's FLAMAGRA. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. FLAMAGRA is the weakest release in Flying Lotus's discography in my opinion, and it's the one album that really sticks out to me as being disappointing as an album experience. This record consists of 27 tracks and has a runtime of 67 minutes, making it very easily, far and away, the longest album in Flylo's entire catalogue. This album takes a bit of a funkier approach to some of the sounds that Flying Lotus typically works with, and as a result there are quite a few experimental and quirky soundscapes across this album. However, in my opinion, I don't think all of these experiments really pan out that well. One specific example of an experiment that doesn't really pan out is the song Takashi, which is the longest song in the album at 6 minutes. And it features this very bouncy, funk-inspired beat and groove to it, but it doesn't really have much of a direction, it doesn't really progress to anything. There's a number of 1 to 2 minute tracks on this album as well that don't really serve much of a purpose or advance the very loose concept of fire that you will find across the album. I'm talking about tracks like Pilgrim Side-Eye, Heroes in a Half Shell, All Spies, tracks of that nature. Some of these are kind of strange tracks and a lot of them have an awkward groove to them, which is really a far cry from some of the more immersive and captivating spots in Flylo's discography. This album isn't all bad though, of course it's not all bad, it's Flying Lotus, the dude has so much talent he has to at least have some highlights on the album, and one of those is More featuring Anderson .Paak, which is potentially my favourite song on the album. I love Anderson .Paak's performance on this song, it's so confident and slick, and the smooth jazzy instrumental paired with those angelic backing vocals on the second half of the song. Amazing. Denzel Curry totally kills his feature on the song Black Balloon's Reprise, and the song Post-Requisite kind of sounds like a bit of a jazzier take on Los Angeles era Flying Lotus, and it's a highlight. The song Yellow Belly is a very eccentric and kind of off-kilter moment on this album instrumentally. However, I think the Tierra Whack feature is actually great, and she does a really good job of playing to the eccentricity of the song. FF4 is one of the briefer tracks that I actually think is worthwhile. It's a very short and sweet instrumental, but it's got this very jazzy, delicate and nocturnal feel to it, and I think it sounds great for the time that it's on. Overall, FLAMAGRA does have its great moments, but I think the amount of filler on this album, as well as the very underdeveloped concept, make it Flying Lotus's weakest to date. From one end of the discography to the other, I'm going to go with Flying Lotus's debut album at number 5. Yes, 1983, Flying Lotus's debut. It feels kind of weird to put this one at number 5 because it's a pretty good album. Much better than FLAMAGRA in my opinion, and I must say that from this point on, the placement of each album, the gap in quality between each placement isn't actually going to be that large because Flying Lotus has so many great albums. 1983 sees Flylo kick off his career with what I believe is his most hip-hop centric album. Even at this early stage, he still has a knack for blending hip-hop with electronica and IDM, and he does it pretty well here. 1983, comparative to all Flying Lotus's other albums, is much more in line with his contemporaries, people like Madlib and Jay Dilla, and you can really hear the influence on this album. It's pretty undeniable. A lot of the tracks on here are very spacey and atmospheric, such as the opening title track, which is brilliant, really shows off Flying Lotus's talent and his knack for beat making. The track has an incredibly immersive cosmic soundscape, and it really is one of my favourite Flying Lotus tracks of all time. The track Bad Actors has a very soulful flair to it, and it also sounds like it contains some really left field, like Japanese sample. Could be wrong about that. This song in particular sounds very much like something Jay Dilla would have done at the time. I can definitely hear this song fitting very comfortably onto the Donuts track list. Same thing can be said for Shifty, even though I really like the groove of this instrumental. It does remind me a lot of Jay Dilla's style. The track Unexpected Delight featuring Laura Darlington is actually a very wondrous way for this album to close out, and this is not the last time we're going to mention Laura Darlington, by the way. She shows up in Flying Lotus's discography quite a lot, like 4 or 5 times. The only real problem I have with 1983 is that it's more derivative than everything Flying Lotus would go on to release afterwards, which isn't even that much of a bad thing, because this is how a lot of artists really make their way into the industry. They are taking ideas from their influences and trying to work out their own sound. I personally feel that what Flylo would go on to do with his later releases would really allow him to branch out into a sound and an aesthetic that is very much unique to him. That being said, I just feel like this album might be generally underrated, especially nowadays, because it's not on any streaming services. Apart from YouTube, you can go on YouTube and listen to this album, which is how I listen to it. But because it's not on the major streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music, a lot of people might just not bother to listen to it. But if you love the production styles of Madlib and Jay Dilla, or you're just a big instrumental hip-hop fan in general, then 1983 is for sure worth your time. Give it a listen. Coming off of the density and the expansiveness of Cosmogramma, Flying Lotus wanted to switch up his sound and scale things back a little bit, which is something he talks about in an interview with The National in 2012. Here's the direct quote from that interview. "I think I'd have been in a bad position if I tried to recreate the same energy as I did on Cosmogramma. How about we pull back, try to do something that gets to the core of the emotional sentiment, not so grand, more intimate." The result of this desire to switch gears was Until the Quiet Comes, and I do think generally this album features more dreamy and light soundscapes. I would say that this switch up really gives this record a lot of room to breathe, and it really lets the listener immerse themselves in the world that Flylo creates. One of the tracks that I think best exemplifies this is the title track. I think the way that those lead vocals kind of lead you into the atmosphere of the instrumental is breathtaking. Getting There featuring Nicky Randa is another example. The song features loose percussion paired with very subtle ambience and some ghostly distant vocals from Nicky. It's a stunning highlight. Electric Candyman featuring Tom York is one of the more experimental moments on the album. It creates this very warped and strange atmosphere, but I think that Tom York's eccentric vocals really stand out, and they actually really work in a song and an atmosphere like this. Phantasm featuring the aforementioned Laura Darlington is a very fruitful collaboration once again between these two, and yeah, she just does a great job every time she's on one of these songs. I do think that the very low-key nature of this album produces some spots that are a little more underdeveloped, such as the very jazzy Only If You Wanna, which I would have loved to hear kind of extended into something more long form. I'm also a little bit unsure if the track The Night Caller fits in with the aesthetic of this album. However, for the most part, Until the Quiet Comes is a pretty successful transition into slightly different musical territory for Flying Lotus. And I also do think that this record stands alone in the sense that it's a very specific point in his artistic trajectory. Okay, Los Angeles at the 3rd spot. This is the follow-up to Flying Lotus's debut, 1983, and it sees him continue to primarily operate in the field of instrumental hip-hop. But this album, by comparison, really sees him master his particular experimentalist brand of hip-hop, as the fusions with electronica and IDM are much more creative and expansive than they were on his debut. Los Angeles maintains a consistent and a cohesive atmosphere throughout its runtime, and as is the case with almost every Flying Lotus record, it creates a world in which the listener can really lose themselves in. There's so many inventive electronica and hip-hop fusions all across this album, one of the best being Breathe Something / Stellar Star, wow that's difficult to say, undeniable head bopper and kicks off the album very well. The song Camel really builds on itself incredibly well, adding more layers and cycling through different musical passages as the track progresses. Riot is one of the tenser moments on the album, with its tight and insistent groove really keeping hold of you for the entirety of the song. And immediately following this is the track Gangbang, which is a two-part instrumental featuring a pretty effortless beat switch at the midpoint. The first half of this song contains these off-the-wall, potentially like Middle Eastern samples. It creates this really weird, quirky atmosphere. And then the second half just features this driving, heavy percussion. Also, the track Sleepy Dinosaur has this very loose and intoxicating kind of groove to it. One of my favourites on the album for sure. The few features that you'll find on the album all come towards the back end, and they're all pretty great. Ahu adds a dreamy feel to the song Roberta Flack. Gonja Sufi has a very airy and expressive feature on the song Testament, and again, Laura Darlington showing up here to close out the album in a very low-key and hushed way on the track Auntie's Lock / Infinitum. Honestly, I don't really have much of a problem with Los Angeles at all. I mean, there's like 1 or 2 songs on here that are very brief and don't really add a whole lot to the album, but you know, apart from that, the album is cohesive, it's consistent, and it's the record in Flying Lotus's discography that sees him perfect his own approach to beatmaking. I do, however, believe that Flying Lotus went on to release some more essential works when he really started to explore the world of jazz. And speaking of jazz, at number 2, I have what is, in my view, Flylo's most jazz-oriented release to date. When I was re-listening to this album as well as my number 1, which you've obviously figured out by now, it became increasingly more difficult to decide for me which one was better, because they're both so great, but after careful deliberation, I think I'm going to place You're Dead at the number 2 spot. I believe that this is the most overtly conceptual and thematic album that Flylo has ever released, revolving around kind of a loose concept of death and the afterlife. You're Dead consists of 19 tracks at a mere 38-minute runtime. Most of the songs are between 1 and 3 minutes. I think this really works in the album's benefit, as it gives Flylo a chance to explore loads of different sounds and ideas in a very short amount of time, and I think he does most of the ideas a very good amount of justice. A bulk of this album features production and instrumentation in the realm of jazz and jazz fusion. However, you will also find the electronica and hip-hop elements that are consistent throughout his whole discography. There are only 2 songs on the whole album that surpass the 3-minute mark, one of which being the lead single, Never Catch Me, featuring Kendrick Lamar. Fantastic song. Kendrick's verse and his performance are both very urgent, and he drops a lot of dense bars about death and coming to terms with your own demise. I love the different musical phases across this track, especially the final third, which is just one of my favourite moments on the whole album. Snoop Dogg, who has obviously built up his reputation of featuring on anything, anywhere, at any time, as long as he gets paid, he actually comes through on the track Dead Man's Tetris, and he drops one of his most interesting and high quality features. There's so many songs on here that create this entrancing and hypnotic feel, such as one of my favourites, which is Siren Song featuring Angel Deradurian. The slow pace and the build-up of this song are just so intoxicating. The musicianship on this album is top-notch, which is really no surprise considering that Thundercat plays bass across almost the whole album. Herbie Hancock is on keys for a couple of tracks. Kamasi Washington shows up and plays the sax on a couple of these tracks. You really can't go wrong with this album overall. It's musically rich, it's textured, it's conceptual, albeit kind of loosely. However, of course, one album still remains. Here we are. Flying Lotus's number 1 album, in my opinion, is Cosmogramma. As I said previously, I did find it pretty hard to pick which album I would put at number 1 between You're Dead and Cosmogramma. But I think the main reason I ended up going with Cosmogramma is because I believe it's the best culmination of all the styles that Flying Lotus typically works with, that being hip-hop, electronica, IDM, and jazz. While I don't think that Cosmogramma is quite as conceptual or cohesive from track to track as You're Dead is, and it certainly holds its own in those regards, I do think that the musical ground this album covers more than makes up for that. This album features a very maximalist approach to production, which gives it a complete and a comprehensive feel. There's so much attention to detail. A track like Zodiac Shit sees Flylo take his beat-making ability to a whole nother level. It's much more experimental and detailed than anything you'll find on his first two albums. It features a bunch of instrumental bells and whistles, all these additional pieces, and great beat switch halfway through as well. The track Computer Face / Pure Being features these mind-bending electronics, and it's super exhilarating, immediately followed up by the track And the World Laughs With You featuring Tom York, which is a much more subtle exercise in electronics, but it's just as gripping as the previous track. The track Do the Astral Plane is one of my favourite tracks of all time by any artist. The groove is irresistible, there's so much going on, but it never once feels overbearing. The progression and the build-up of this song is fantastic. I have so much fun listening to this song, and it really is just a very unique moment in Flying Lotus's whole catalogue. There are moments on here that really deeply explore jazz, like Artistry, which sounds like a very modern take on the cosmic jazz of someone like Sun Ra. The track Table Tennis, again featuring Laura Darlington, contains this wonderfully placed sample of a bouncing ping pong ball. The fact that Flylo is able to take that and make that the foundation of the song, and make it sound as good and as rich as it does, is just a mark of his creativity as a producer. Cosmogramma is just so packed with detailed and futuristic production. I think it's one of the best albums of the 2010s, and I also think that it's Flying Lotus's best work to date. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. I genuinely forgot how many great albums Flying Lotus actually has until I really started to get into these albums again and re-experience all of them. If you've heard Flying Lotus's whole discography, then feel free to rank his albums in the comments down below. And if you haven't heard Flying Lotus's discography, then I hope this video has made you want to go and listen to it. And you should, because it's a really good discography. If you've made it this far into the video, I really do appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.